Hello and welcome to this episode of Bookshook. I am Jahnavi Sen and with me I have Alina Gufran. She's a writer and a filmmaker and her debut novel, No Place to Call My Own, was recently released. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
The novel follows the protagonist Sophia as she navigates her life in her 20s mostly. Her work, her struggles to be a writer, her relationships, her friendships, the way she interacts with her parents whom she's not particularly close to. And all of this is happening in the context of an India which is becoming increasingly hard on minorities. She's born to a Hindu mother and a Muslim father who are no longer together, and that also plays a role in the way the story develops. Now, the story is told in the first person, but it doesn't seem like it's blind to Sophia's flaws or messes, or she's not perfect. But even then, it does seem, and while she's being truthful, it does seem like if it were to be told from a third person perspective, it might look a little bit different.
Yeah.
Do you think of her as an unreliable narrator?
Yeah, so essentially I started developing the book from chapter 3. That's the chapter that came to me first. And I was very intrigued by the idea of putting a girl in a situation where she doesn't end up doing the right thing, and also kind of perhaps interrogating what the idea of the right thing is and how much of it is justified. What does that moral burden look like? What was interesting to me in that particular chapter when I started writing the story was the gap between the reality of what was happening and what was going on in her head, and how she's able to justify her actions as well. And of course, it's tinged with a lot of shame, but that dichotomy of a person being who they need to be and they should be and who they really are, and you're especially able to experience it in the first person because you're in her head constantly, was extremely interesting to me, because I do feel that, literature is that one place which isn't exactly the realm for politeness, and you can really get into the psyche of a character. So yeah, by and large, I would call her an unreliable narrator.
I feel like you've sort of pointed to this already in your answer, but a lot of the book is about her interiority. It's about what she's thinking, what she's going through, the decisions she's making. But at least to me, reading it, it felt like as the book progressed, you saw external factors play in more and more. And then towards the end, they became equally important in some ways as what she was thinking. Was that a progression that you planned? Was it sort of a nod to the intensifying atmosphere in the country?
Yeah, I think definitely a bit of both. More than anything else, initially, the way the book starts, you're primarily in her head, and her concerns might even seem frivolous to somebody, right? And a lot of the concerns aren't as well. They're about being an artist, about making it in this artistic ecosystem that we live in the country that isn't that well supported.
And about having an abortion.
Yeah, exactly.
Not frivolous in the least.
Also about sort of being at the periphery of these very elite bourgeoisie circles she inhabits, and she is a part of it because her education has afforded that, but she never really truly feels like she belongs in these circles, because truly these circles are also concentrated in the hands of upper caste, upper class people, and as maybe class isn't that big a factor, but she's always very aware of her identity as somebody, and also being the child of immigrants, etc. But I think as the novel progresses, the reason the outside world becomes that much more pronounced is because she is having an awakening of some kind, whereas the doubts about her identity or the way she contends with the contradictions of who she is in the beginning feel internal. You soon realize that that's not entirely true, and perhaps that alienation from oneself is not just something you're born with. It is something that's kind of repeated to you, and it becomes a refrain over the ages. I think another interesting point for me to explore, which is also a little bit of a lived experience, is that we talk a lot about how 2014 was a turning point.
Yeah.
And sure, in many ways it was, but I think for a lot of Muslims and other minorities living in the country, it's tough to just pinpoint 2014. And that is also something that she starts contending with towards the second half of the novel. Yeah.
When I was before I started reading and I was looking at the contents, and each chapter is the name of a city, and in a way I thought maybe spaces would play a strong role. Yeah. Like the city is a character along with her being a character, but that's not really the case, or so I felt by the time I was I was done with it.
Yeah.
In that she is inhabiting these spaces, these different spaces, and the fact that she is going to so many of them does shape who she is. But it's not like the space is as important as to her life, to the way she is. What went behind thinking of each chapter as a different place?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one was a very technical point of view for me, just from a craft perspective. I wanted to see how she would change, adapt, and the ways in which she wouldn't be able to adapt, navigating all these different spaces. I think with children of immigrants, adaptation, and not just children of immigrants, but also people who aren't born into families that are granted societal approval right from the outset, code switching or having to adapt is kind of second nature, right? So for me, that was always a very interesting and characteristic part of who she is. So one was just that. From a craft perspective, I was like, okay, I want to situate her in all these different places where she's coming across situations and people that kind of, in part, reflect her world back to her. And in spaces where you think she would feel like she belongs the most are the spaces where she feels the most alienated from, which is why in chapter 2, or I want to say 3, I'm not sure, 2, but I think when she's in Beirut and she's hanging out with a bunch of Arab filmmakers, essentially, she feels more of a kinship than she does, let's say, back in Delhi, with her peers who are kind of assimilating into their parents' businesses and such. So when I do write, I tend to use a space as a backdrop because I think there's a lot in the environment the character can react to. So that's one. And another is that there's a certain urban alienation that's kind of hard to escape for all of us. And even for the character, because the book is hyper contemporary, set in the now, it felt like I would be remiss to not couch it in the location that she's present in.
You've been working in film for a while.
Yeah.
What about this story felt to you like it's a novel and not a film?
Yeah, that's a really nice question, actually. I don't know. I think when I first started writing the novel, it was at the heels of the pandemic. So the industry had shut down. I'd kind of lost a lot of my income sources. And I was used to also screenwriting, but I was a writer for hire, right? I was constantly being commissioned. And there was something about this story where prose has always been a first love. It's been a refuge from the world. And I was just compelled to compelled to write it. I think for the first time, like many of us, we were all kind of taking stock of our lives. And for me, the natural conduit for this story became prose. I actually never even thought of it for the screen. And I think it's primarily for selfish reasons because I just wanted complete control over the narrative. Yeah.
Now, because the novel is written in the first person and also because you and Sophia do share some biographical details, like where you studied filmmaking. Yeah. Do people often assume that it's autobiographical, and how do you respond to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's been the constant refrain, right, since the beginning of the tour, where everyone is intrigued, and that is the primary concern of whether it's autobiographical or not. But I understand the reason why people might need answers to something like that, but I also think it's sort of bit of a moot point because I don't think it should necessarily matter. I also think historically the writers that have inspired me, like Elena Ferrante or Lispector or, any of these sort of authors in the canon, have always carried the burden of something having to be autobiographical for it to be qualified as literary fiction. Or Olivia Lang, I mean, I can go on. These things, examples are endless. And I don't think people realize it, but I do think there's a bit of a gendered approach to this. All fiction somewhere does come from a lived experience. It's colored by your own bias as a writer. You're kind of imprinting your DNA onto the world in so many ways. But I do believe that fiction writers don't necessarily owe people whatever version of truth they might be looking for. So that's one. But another is that I simply don't think I possess that level of self-awareness to write a character like me, Yeah.
We were talking earlier about the ending of the book and how, the external world is more imprinting more and more on her life.
Yeah.
And what we see around then, it's the end of the anti-CAA protests and the communal violence in Northeast Delhi in early 2020, and then the start of the COVID lockdown. Now that's a period that I think for a lot of us, maybe especially in this city, but nationally, was formative and in some ways, but it also in some does feel like it was a long time ago because so much has happened in the last 5 years, and they do say that this is about pandemics and memory that sort of blurs the passing of years, and also from the trauma you want to forget and things like that. What was it like writing about that period?
Yeah, actually, it was a strange experience because the time I was writing those bits was very close to when this had happened. So in some ways, it was a very immediate response to what was happening. For me, the second half of the novel feels intensely personal, actually, because in a very visceral sense, for me, it was a reaction. I was in Goa. I was very politically and culturally disconnected from what was happening in Delhi. Even though my family's from here, I've sort of spent some formative years here as a child. And there was a certain sense of helplessness. And the only tool that I really have is fiction. So it just felt like I would be lying to myself and to the readers if I didn't make that a part of the narrative. I do know that in chapter 9 is a major turning point in the novel, and it becomes quite visceral. But I thought it was important to document it somehow, especially in fiction. Stories do become a way of remembering, and it wasn't so much about the readers, but just for myself, it became a way to kind of mark that inflection point, because as much as I understand psychologically it might be important to forget, I also think it's important not to. And very recently, fresh spate of violence in Nagpur, and yeah, so I just thought it's essential to have it down on paper.
I mean, what you're saying now about you having written it then makes a lot of sense to me, because while I read it, it did feel like things we felt in the moment, and kind of bringing that back to now when it feels like it kind of almost happened to someone else.
Yeah. It was a bit of a double-edged sword, because I was, like I said, I was away from Delhi. There was no way really I could contribute to anything happening, but I was glued to online mediums and going into a fair bit of a spiral about what was really going on. And I suppose when, 80s have happened or early 90s have happened, I've just been a child. But this was me witnessing it in a city I was born in as an adult. So to not do anything about it just felt wrong. Yeah.
You talked about this a little bit already, but in a slightly different context. So I'm going to ask it anyway.
Sure.
Are there some writers that you feel particularly influenced by that you think have affected your work in certain ways?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a spate of sort of the postmodernists. There's Clarice Lispector, of course, who was not really considered anything until much later, posthumously, which always seems to be the case. But I do think she's a bit of a genius and, rightfully deserves her space in the canon. There's Gaitskill, Shirley Jackson. Then on this side of the world, I would say Avni Doshi's recent book really inspired me. It was the first time that motherhood was really spelt out like that in the South Asian context. Yeah, these are some I can think of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just before we close, this is usually something I'm very curious about.
Yeah.
Is there something you've read recently or are reading now that you're enjoying? Not even necessarily as an influence, but just...
Yeah.
And also maybe because of your past in film, maybe something you watched as well?
Yeah, I think two things actually. One was, I just finished reading yesterday, The Anthropologists.
Yeah, I love it.
By, I can't pronounce her name right. She's a Turkish author, Aysul Savas, yeah. I haven't read her work before. I'm quite obsessed with the contemporary postmodern writers coming out of the Middle East, but they're like second generation Americans. They're very interesting lens. I thought it was extremely well written. Yeah, I mean, I remember reading the blurb and it says something to the effect of that she is an author who just astoundingly knows. And I felt similarly, because it was just, there was something about her prose that has left an impression on me. I did feel that because of her background and where the story is set and the kind of positionality of the characters, I thought there could be a bit of illusion, because I don't actually believe in politics having to be the subject or something, that, that's a writer's prerogative at the end of the day. But yeah, I thought there might be more of an allusion to the political times, but maybe her next one.
Yeah.
So that was one. And I think in terms of films, actually, I think Anora was absolutely brilliant because I felt like what Sean Baker started with Red Rocket, where he kind of alluded to that, turning of the tide and that character kind of being a metaphor for Trump, he just deepened into that craft and those themes in this particular film.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alina, for joining us today, and thank you all for watching.